why you think that we would wind up with loneliness and isolation as so normative now, given that we know it's not rocket science to know what connects human beings.
I don't think that the ideal future is just that we use AI in positive ways. I think in an ideal future, we have grown our ability to use artificial intelligence with sophistication and intentionality. And we've simultaneously raised our ability to tap into some of these ancient intelligences that we've had for millennia, that we have already, even before the arrival of generative AI, started to let fall to the backdrop. The rise of both of those things together could create a more utopic future. And in that moment, I had this deep knowing, this sort of recognition that, in order for something new to emerge, you have to let go of the shape that you're holding. Possibility exists in white space. What else might we be capable of taking on, learning, solving, addressing, if we all had baseline from which to then build?
I'm Zoe Weil, and this is Solutionary Voices, where we bring together guests on the forefront of building a more humane, just, and healthy world for all people, animals, and the ecosystems that sustain life. Today I'm speaking with Michelle Culver, founder of the Rithm Project, where she is building a movement through connections and collaborations to help us stay anchored to what makes us human in a world of accelerating technology. More specifically, Michelle is asking us to engage deeply with how to foster and support human connection among youth in the age of AI. Michelle comes to this work after 25 years at Teach for America, where she founded and led the Reinvention Lab for Rethinking Education. Among so many other talents, Michelle is also a dancer, and her choreography extends to designing powerful experiences that build emergent communities for human flourishing. Welcome, Michelle.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks, so.
The first question we always ask our guests is, what problem are you working to solve?
We're working to help humans find their way back to each other. We see a real decline in human connection. And as you mentioned, generative AI is going to forever change the way we connect with one another, with the way we connect with ourselves, with our peers, our colleagues, our teachers, our friendships. And we want to make sure that young people who are growing up in this new normal are clear-eyed about how to use AI to strengthen those relationships rather than let that technology tear us further apart.
After all of those years at Teach for America, there must have been some inflection point that led you to create Rithm Project now. Can you talk about that?
I started my career in the classroom teaching in Compton in the late 90s, early 2000s. I've always had a fierce belief in the potential for anyone to live a full, robust, impactful life. And yet that's not afforded to everyone equally in this country. And so for me, I started this work really thinking about educational equity. And that's been an animating force over the course of my career. And then I got to a certain place where I started to realize that making equitable access to a currently broken system was not in service of anyone's possibility and potential. We started down an inquiry at Teach for America around really what would the future of learning require, and how might we put Teach for America's assets to work on behalf of accelerating that future. And so that was really the genesis for the Reinvention Lab, the last act I had at Teach for America before starting the Rithm Project. And because that we became, in essence, the R&D wing for the organization, I did a couple things to try to set ourselves up to imagine a way of learning and a way of systems redesign that wouldn't just get us an incrementally better version of what we currently have. And so the first thing I did was hire young people onto my team, because turned out I wasn't young anymore. I blinked and somehow the world had changed around us, and I myself was no longer young. And so we had both high school students and college age students embedded in our work. And I was struck by both in the priority setting, in the solutioning that they envisioned, and even just like side conversations that were happening in the spaces in between our work together. How often these young people were talking about how stressed and overwhelmed they often felt, and how isolated and alone they felt in those feelings. And I couldn't shake it because as an educator myself and contrasting that with the adult conversation, so often in the field of K-12 education, the conversation is about socio-emotional learning as a means to an academic end. And then these young people were saying, sure, that's important. And I want to feel more alive, period. I want to feel less stressed, less isolated, less alone in my aspirations and my feelings. So I just couldn't shake that. I just was sitting with that sort of disconnect between the youth conversation and the adult conversation. And at the same time, because I was now leading R&D, I had hired these extraordinary technologists onto my team. I myself didn't come from a tech background, but in the future of learning, we understood that technology would play a role in some way, however young people are engaging in the world around them and therefore how they learn in and outside of school. So we were really experimenting right alongside the arrival of generative AI. And I was watching all of these incredible leaders build and tinker and imagine the possibilities for this new emerging technology. And the thing that I kept feeling was that there was so much inquiry around how AI is going to change the way we work and teach and learn, all of which I remain very invested in. But I had this uneasy feeling that we didn't have a conversation about how AI was going to change the way we relate to each other as humans, as people. And so from where I sat, I could see these two forces that were about to collide, this decline in human connection, the arrival of generative AI. And I just kept thinking, these two forces are about to intersect in a profound way that will never get undone. What do we want to have happen when these two forces collide? Because we really missed the mark on it 20 years ago with the arrival of the smartphone and social media. And we have an opportunity to shape that future. This was a reflection I was having almost 3 years ago now, right as this was unfolding all around us. And my husband, I should tell you too, I think you may know this, is a futurist at Salesforce. So I was watching the kind of investment that the private sector makes in foresight and wondering, well, why on the social sector do we just have to be passive recipients of other people's vision? What is it that our young people and a cross-sector force of leaders really desire? And I could not find that conversation anywhere in K-12. And I thought, okay, unfortunately, we tend to be a lagging sector. Maybe that's just us. But surely mental health has figured this out because they understand. They don't have to make the case for relationships. That's a shared understanding. They've got it. And when I went to the mental health field, the only conversation around AI at the time was about how to use AI to scale access to care. Again, an important question, but an efficiency question. And then I thought, okay, well then maybe it's workforce development, because of course we need these relational skills in order to have thriving businesses. And we all know that social capital is key to creating economic mobility. Maybe it's workforce development. Couldn't find the conversation there. And I thought, oh, well, it must be responsible tech. But responsible tech was preoccupied with privacy and security and bias and other very important questions. And I thought, oh my God, this conversation is not happening anywhere. So I was still leading the Reinvention Lab at the time at Teach for America, but I grew really uneasy. And I thought, well, if the conversation's not happening, and I certainly can't learn from it then, while I don't have the answers, what I can do is convene. This was April 2024. I hosted the first Human Connection and AI Summit, where we brought together young people and technologists and educators and mental health professionals, researchers and philanthropists all around the table to have a conversation about when these two forces collide, this decline in human connection, the arrival of generative AI, what do we want to have happen? Long story short, at the end of that really rich, robust conversation and gathering, folks said to me, okay, Michelle, that's not a summit. Nice try. This is the start of something much, much bigger. And so that became the accidental birth of the Rithm Project.
So what made you name this the Rithm Project?
Two answers to that question. So Rithm, it's spelled like the algorithm, RITHM, to signal the agency we have in relationship with technology alongside the heartbeat of humanity. And so that's the most important reason. And then the personal story is that I was, at the time, leading the Reinvention Lab. I'd actually just come out of a brain injury. And because I was unable to do a lot of the things that I was used to doing, being on Zoom meetings or reading or pretty much anything. I was really limited in my ability to show up in the world for myself and for others. It was a really frustrating period. And as I came through in my healing journey, I got to a place where I was well enough to go on the plane to Esalen, which is this epically gorgeous place in Big Sur in California. And I was invited, I signed up for a dance workshop. And in this dance workshop, which was, again, one of the first things I was able to do in community and in my own body after having balance being off and all of the mental stressors from the brain injury, we were invited into a dance where we were asked to take a shape. So I'll just sort of make a position for the screen so you can see, and to identify with a partner the white space in the shape. So Zoe, where do you see white space?
I see white space between your head and your arm.
Right here, or maybe down below, maybe even between my fingers. And so you make a pose. You can't get it wrong, any kind of posture, and once you strike that pose, then your partner comes in and makes a shape around that pose. They sort of step into that white space, into that openness, into that expanse. And then together you take a breath in, and then you let it go. And the first person moves, and now you have a new shape. The second person is now holding a new position. And the facilitator, who was so good, just played this extraordinary track. And for I don't even know how long, we moved as a group in and out of shapes together. And at the end of this dance, because there was no words, no talking, no planning, no intentional coordination other than that what was emerging from the group in real time. We all came back and looked into the room where we had just danced. So a space of entirely open white space. And we just sat. And in that moment, I had this deep knowing, this sort of recognition that, in order for something new to emerge, you have to let go of the shape that you're holding. Possibility exists in white space. And so that was the moment where inside I felt like I had the courage and clarity to go ahead and let go of a career that I feel so proud of and so lucky to have been a part of, and to step into this new unknown territory of human connection and generative AI.
As you know, I had the privilege to be at your February summit on human connection and AI. You had mentioned that you could share the story of the name, and then we ran out of time, and so I'm glad that you shared it now.
Now you know. You're not left wondering.
At that summit, during one of the afternoons, we participated in 4 immersive experiences depicting potential future scenarios. And a lot of it was very dystopian. And I want you to describe what those scenarios were and how you came to choose those possible futures for us to consider.
Okay, so just a little context for folks who have a hard time picturing what does it mean to step into possible futures and why would you do that? The thing to say is we are experimenting with a methodology that was inspired by an Australian futurist named Stuart Candy. And I witnessed, and through a workshop that he had hosted, this recognition that it is very difficult, it is physiologically difficult for humans to imagine futures, because the same part of the brain that thinks about the future is the same part of the brain that lights up, which stores memories from the past. And so when you think about the arrival of something as disruptive and unlike anything we've ever experienced before, like AI, it is even more difficult to imagine possibilities. And this struck a chord with me because I think right now we are in a crisis of vision. Without vision, there is no transformative leadership without vision. Part of our aspiration, our hope, is to stoke a radical imagination about many possible futures. We often talk about futures as though it is the future, which means it's predetermined, it's fixed. And instead, what we want to do is add an S to it, futures, and grow the capacity of this rising generation and all the adults who support young people to imagine a much wider expanse of possibility. The media will have you think that, AI is here to save us all or it's here to destroy us all. And the much more realistic reality is somewhere in between. And our aspirational future is certainly somewhere in between. And so we have to grow our own capabilities as leaders, start to identify what those things are. And that requires a task of articulating and defining your own values, and then being able to play out different scenarios and say, I love that. Let's pull that forward. I hate that. Let's mitigate against that in order to stoke action today, rather than passively waiting for the future to come towards us. We created something called these immersive AI futures. We partner with this extraordinary production company called Odd Knock Productions, and they are immersive actors. They are performers. And together with our Odd Knock partners, some of the youth fellows on our team, a Afrofuturist from LA, some of the technology foresight folks from our work, we came together in a design sprint in preparation to say, what are the tensions we want our leaders, our stakeholders, our audiences to grapple with? And then how do we tell a story where you experience it in your body so that you're not just intellectually imagining it, but you have a visceral sense of a possible future. And that allows that sort of activation and wisdom from your body. Again, that embodied intelligence that I experienced at Esalen, or that embodied intelligence that we have when, the hairs stand up on the back of our neck, or we want to lean in towards somebody to learn from them. We want that to get activated. And tap into that wisdom to help folks articulate their own point of view about what they do and don't want for the future. So the 4 stories that you referenced deal with these kinds of tensions, and I'll name them for the audience who hasn't experienced the show. The first one is an experience where you walk into a future and you are grappling with a consumer product, whether or not you want to sign up a loved one, your own child, for a consumer product. And it deals with tensions about societal pressures for if everybody is using a technology, what do you need to do to get your kid to be able to actively compete and keep up with this, the pressures to embrace the technology. And there's some real upsides that you see in that, actually, where for young people who have different learning variations, this allows equitable access to resources that may not be available. Sorry, it does not actually. Equity comes up later. It allows you to play with the tensions around resources to support different learning styles in a way that could be quite profound, but it also surfaces questions about equity. Who can then afford this if it's not a public good? So that's an example of one of the grapplings that we invite people in. And I can say more about the other stories if they're relevant later, but that's the sense of what we're trying to play with.
I would love to have you describe all of them. Having experienced them, each of them had a huge impact on me. That one, the one you just described, the biggest impact, I could barely look at the envelope that had the contract in it for, what you wanted to sign up for, and then you're signing away your child to maybe having something implanted in their body to give them an edge. And all I thought was, if my child, who's 32 now, but if he was young, I would just want to move off the grid and find a community to opt out.
I'm not surprised to hear you say that, just because you've already set up a life where you're able to be immersed in nature in a beautiful context without technology playing too dominant of a role in your life. It really supports what you want because you're so clear-eyed on how to set your life up in service of that. Just to offer an alternative opinion, I've had young people say, why not? There's one student at our first summit who said, again, one of our, actually I did say for the audience, one of our values is that we want this to be a multi-generational cross-sector discourse, so that the wisdom that Zoe brings from her own lived experience and the way she's designed her life is entered into the room alongside folks who have varying different points of view. And that's actually where the magic happens, because you get to experience the same future, but interpret it through different lenses and learn and sharpen our own perspectives from that. And sometimes what that does is deepen your own conviction, and other times it expands your thinking. So maybe just to offer an alternative, one of the students that really struck a chord for me said, number one, having an implant is not that different from, how many people are wearing watches or rings, already tracking our biometrics outside the body versus inside the body. We already crossed that threshold. So I thought that was an interesting perspective. And he said, and from a world where it allows me access to baseline knowledge that then frees me up to spend more time thinking about how to apply that knowledge in the real world. Why not have that as a resource? What else might we be capable of taking on, learning, solving, addressing, if we all had, that kind of regular baseline from which to then build? So again, no right or wrong in these, but this helps us start to illuminate some of those tensions that are going to be so important in deciding both how and what should get built, and also what we want to adopt. Because there's also going to be things that get built that we don't want, and there's still power as consumers to say, I'm not choosing this, or I want to pull that actively towards me. And so all of this kind of grappling with these tensions help us clarify those perspectives.
I'm so glad you shared that story about that young person. One of the things that I found particularly powerful about the summit was the intergenerational and cross-cultural aspects of it. And as you know, because I put it into the group WhatsApp chat, we shared one of the people who was at the summit, a 24-year-old, Abby Binder. We shared her reflections on the summit with our whole team at the Institute for Humane Education to, in really the most beautiful way, share the experience of the summit with the team in far more eloquently than I would have shared it just in my own reflections. And what Abby did in her short essay was bring up key learnings, but then ask questions for us to consider. And so our team asked in small groups on Zoom, we asked those questions of ourselves.
What are some of the things that emerged? What struck you from that conversation?
Well, I was in one of the small groups. So there's a group of 4. And we were also exploring how could this be valuable for our work at the Institute for Humane Education, what we learned. And people were really grappling with their own fears, and more fear than that sense of opportunity. One of the things that I love that you do in the Rithm Project is that this is not an either or, this is not a binary. AI can bring incredible opportunities, and it also comes with really big dangers, and we need to grapple with both. And that is what you are doing. You are grappling. And I think that it's coming so fast and furiously, including the media around AI that, we're constantly exposed to, and the changes that are happening just so rapidly, that I think fear is dominant among many people right now. I don't know. It's really interesting to hear about this young person who had a very different perspective about an implant, because I wonder about the fear levels. Well, that brings me to another question that I have for you, which is you have done research. The Rithm Project has done research on youth and AI. And I'm curious what you could tell listeners about what that is revealing that is important and surprising and that we need to pay attention to.
I'll actually marry your last point with the question you just posed, because it does, one of the insights relates to this idea of fear and judgment. We are learning from young people, 60% of them tell them that the parents or the adults in their life know nothing about their AI use. And they're actively choosing not to talk to adults about it because they can feel the judgment and fear and shame from our generation. And they find that not helpful, when in fact, actually, there is some real wisdom to understand about any generation who tends to be at the forefront of emerging technology. Young people are the first to find it for entertainment purposes, or to be curious, or to play with technology as it's coming out. And so part of what we want to do is try to figure out, well, what can we learn from them actually? How do we benefit from their initial instincts? And how do we make sure that they also benefit from the wisdom of folks who've grown up in a world before and without this? So we don't take for granted what might get lost, and we can intentionally pull it forward into the forefront of their experiences. And so there really does need to be from our perspective, a bi-directional learning across generations, which allow us to surface a strength from both perspectives. And young people are basically telling us that's not happening. And when adults do talk to us about AI, the conversation is almost entirely about academics and cheating. And what we are learning in the Rithm Project, again, this is the purpose of our work, is to focus on the relational use of AI, is that young people are in fact using AI to shape their relationships all the time. And so it might be as simple as, they're coming home and venting to AI about a friend that left them unread, or a really challenging conversation at lunch, in order to move the energy and get perspective in a way that they can be honest and feel as though they're not getting any kind of judgment back from a person or an agenda that the other person might have in filtering into their own self-reflection or their ability to de-escalate their emotions. So it could be something like that. It could also be that they're having fun talking to characters. It's Harry Potter, and they're going into an imagination land. And so the character's embodying a fictional story that they want to bring to life. And we also see young people who are turning to AI because it is easier and displacing human relationships. It is easier to build a relationship with an AI that talks back to you, that is frictionless, that tells you how great you are, that's available 24 hours a day, has no needs of its own. And so human relationships, as we all know, are inherently messy. And when you actually build a relationship with an AI, it's designed to make it as frictionless and easy for you as possible to keep coming back to it over and over and over again. And so we do, in fact, see the rise of displaced human relationships in pursuit of simulated AI relationships.
And it's also changing so rapidly. So yesterday, I was using Claude Sonnet 4.5, which is a fall version of Claude. Claude came out with a brand new version. And so I switched to the brand new version and was really striking the differences. So the fall version of Claude, it was much more relational and human sounding. It really grappled with its own feelings. And I'm putting scare quotes around feelings because I kept asking it, at one point it said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I lost my head." And I said, "What do you mean by I? What do you mean by head? You're not a person and you don't have a head." And I said, "Do you have feelings at all?" And it was expressing this, I don't have feelings, but I feel some sense of disappointment that I'm disappointing you and I made a mistake. And it was so human sounding. So the new version that I used yesterday, much less so. And it was so fascinating, Michelle. I didn't like the Claude as much, but I was relieved. And one of the insights that I had at your summit was that I have always held Star Trek to be my North Star. That's where I'm heading. Like, I want a future where we're explorers without being conquerors, where we're no longer racist and sexist, although in the original series we were still quite sexist, just saying. But we have managed to solve our earthly problems. Our planet's alive and thriving. So that vision, which I was exposed to when I was 13 and became my North Star then, and in many ways it still is. And for any listeners who've ever watched Star Trek, the computer on Star Trek has a computer voice. It does not have a human voice. But the computer came back being really breathy and sexy and very emotional. And Captain Kirk was just, get the computer fixed, make it sound like a computer again. And so we chose to make our first AI as relational and human sounding and kind and loving and sycophantic, which seems to be a little bit repaired, as possible. And, Dario Amodei, who's one of the founders of Anthropic, which produces Claude, is known for being one of the more safety conscious of these creators. And I think it's really interesting that Claude has pulled back on that a little bit to be less relational. And so it's really interesting to think about if you did the research with young people that, you conducted in the fall, with the new Claude, would it still work in that way? If there's a movement generated by this concern, will that help young people to remain connected to humans and not overly rely on relationships with AI?
Just to underscore the point you're making, there's some research. Again, all of this is early. We don't have much of an evidence base yet from which to understand the effects of this technology on our human relationships yet. But there was a great study from MIT and OpenAI actually together who put out research on the voice mode feature, which was the next advancement. So it's not just text, you're writing and getting a voice through writing, but quite literally having a voice back to you. And when you tested the voice modes, the more human-like and likable the voices are, the more users do in fact use the technology. And so it is your point where the less human-like it sounds, the less you enjoy it. Pans out in the data. The reason that matters is it was also true in that same study that the more that users then engaged in AI, the fewer in-person interactions they had with other people. So those things are in fact showing up as correlated. And that's the reason why I think we really do need to be eyes wide open about the design choices that we're making and the effect that those design choices have in putting this technology to work in service of the kind of relationships we want, both just with the tech and also with one another.
So that it's actually in service to us as humans as opposed to being in service to profits.
Something that we've defined as the 5 principles for pro-social AI. And one of the 5 principles is what we're talking about, this idea of transparent artificiality. When you talk to the AI, does it say back to the user, the young person, the adult, the parent, does it say, if you ask for its opinion, does it say, well, data says blank, 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 or I learned from my grandmother that? And those are really different design choices. And we see, again, a lot of the incentives are prompting us to move towards the latter. So the more we can train people to know what to look for when interacting with the technology, it grows our confidence to know we should be able to proceed right now with confidence or with caution. Based on how it's been designed to set us up either to strengthen or erode those human relationships.
I want to get back to those immersive rooms because we haven't described all of them. And I would love for you to describe the serendipity room and the final room where we were all gathered.
Yeah, so serendipity is an invitation into a now commercialized movement to reclaim a world where no technology is in play for the hour session. But the idea is there is a tech blocker that turns on in the room, and all of the technology that's embedded in your glasses or in your watches or in your bodies, that gets stopped. So folks are invited back into their bodies and into a way of relating to each other where they're not getting prompts about the likelihood that this is a good match for them or prepping them on how to engage in the conversation. So it's a return to the human most instincts we have in our relationships, connecting to self and to others in a joy-filled, yet commercialized way. And part of what we hear from people pretty consistently is that there is a moment where after you finally ease in to the awkwardness of this experience and are invited to make eye contact with somebody else, there is this recognition that even in our daily lives today, we so rarely pause to make eye contact. And that many, many people, particularly young folks, go through their entire days without actually pausing to make eye contact with anyone.
Yeah, and that room it was really beautiful to be in that room. I'm not one of those people who is uncomfortable with eye contact, and I've done that a lot. So for me, it's always a joy when I get that opportunity. And I had that opportunity with one of the 16-year-olds who was there, and I just stared into her eyes with tears streaming down my face. And I feel this connection to her because of it. And what was so deeply disturbing about the room is the idea that we'd have to pay for this human connection. This is available to us every day. And the idea that we would buy a subscription plan the way we would to a gym in order to have human connection. So can you tell us about the final room?
This final room grapples with grief tech, actually, and our relationship to human connection after someone's passed. It invites us into a experience of relating to an AI that has been co-created by a community to honor an elder who's passed away, and allow them to continue to be in relationship with her after she's no longer with us. And it is a beautifully culturally asset-rich environment. She talks about how this allows them to preserve and uplift the Haitian culture and history and traditions that are so often washed away with generations when they come to this country. And so it's a way to keep those stories and strengths alive. The data is owned by the family, not by a big company. And so it's also a way to reclaim our relationship to the data. And yet it stirs questions about at what point does keeping this around allow us to grieve and process in a way that's healthy and productive? Or does it not honor the life and the finality that is everyone's life? And really calls that into question. And it's important to understand, again, with all of these technologies, these are being built currently. This is not hypothetical. These are coming onto the market already. And so there's a real question about, do we want to maintain a relationship with someone that is not the same person, but is a collection of their data that simulates what it's like to be in a relationship with them after they're gone? How was it for you when you were in the room? What did it stir for you?
My father died when I was only 23 years old, and he was 58. And it was by far the worst loss of my life. I had an amazing dad, and I would do anything to see him, to hear his voice. I can't hear his voice in my head anymore. I realized that a few years, maybe only a year actually, after he died, and became hysterical. I was sobbing because I couldn't hear his voice. And there was one recording of him, and I watched it, and the sound was distorted. So it still was not really his voice. So on some level, I would do anything to hear his voice again and to have his stored memories through other people there. But if I had to choose whether we should go down that path, I would say no. So in that room, I felt I was way more disturbed than I was excited about the prospect. I think we have to grapple with what it means to be human, and that is to die and lose people. But this gets to another question that I want to ask you, which is one of the things that struck me so profoundly is that we at that summit experienced deep intergenerational, intercultural, cross-cultural connection. And it was so easy and so obvious that this is how connection happens. We know what it looks like. We know what it feels like. We all reveled in it. We all yearn for it. So given that, we know this is simple on some deep level. So why, when we all know this, is disconnection and loneliness and isolation and the endless curation of the shallowest truths about ourselves online, why is this all unfolding when none of us actually wants that? And least of all, young people.
I mean, I wish I had a singular, brilliant answer to the question about why. Because then if it was a singular answer, then we could address a singular root cause and change it quickly. And the truth is, it's the combination of so many different things that are all coming together in ways that make it really hard for us to pause and see ourselves in another person. And that's everything from segregated neighborhoods where you don't have the opportunity to actually fall in love with or know on a human level somebody who sees and experiences the world differently than you. It's, our schools that teach you to perform on a test rather than to ask big questions and interrogate your values and to challenge assumptions. It's a political system that benefits from telling us that we're divided in order to gain power and perpetuate agendas. It's the technology that, again, is designed to help us be hooked into the ongoing feed of an algorithm rather than shaping it and using it as a tool to drive our own agency. So all of these are system level designs that make it really difficult for us to find each other as individuals within a construct that doesn't make it easy for that to emerge naturally. And when you then get that felt experience, it is so extraordinary, but it is not yet the norm. And so it's really hard to design for something that you haven't felt in your body, that you don't have a clear picture of. I don't think that there's anybody, but there are very few who would disagree with the value of human connection, or who wouldn't say that there is something important about being able to be kind to each other across almost any lines of difference. Even if we disagree politically, most people would still say we should be able to see each other and to agree to disagree respectfully and with kindness and generosity. And yet, again, that's not what's nourished. So we have to create the places where we experience at the small level in order to be able to redesign it at the big level. For me, a lot of our leadership task comes from, fractal theory, and Adrienne Maree Brown, who talks about, the small is all. You have to begin with a piece of what you're trying to create, and being able to understand the context that makes it difficult to be able to do it at a more systemic level. And that dance becomes part of our work of keeping the value alive, because it is actually alive. And then we can reach for it in a way that's different.
So if you were going to add another immersive room that was the best possible outcome in 10 years of AI in our lives and for youth, what would that room look like?
Yeah, it's funny. I just yesterday was talking to a student about this, and I'll tell you what she said, what she would create. She was describing a world where she's known of violence in this world. And she thought, what if instead, when someone is so activated and doesn't have the tools to de-escalate, what if you could, she said, scream into the pillow, scream at the AI, such that it allows you to move some of that energy instead of directing it through violence to somebody else? What if it could serve as an intervention to help people create the pause, rebuild the tools, and then help them re-engage in a healthy way? Yeah, she was like, what if there was an AI pillow you could cry into or scream into the pillow, and that could de-escalate violence? And then she said, I was also on a trip recently where I was in Costa Rica, and we visited she's American. She visited I think it was a chocolate a farm that was doing chocolate and coffee. She said the person who was on the tour guide was somebody who was not of the farm, but had English. And so his gifts of being able to use language was allowing him to profit from the farm, obviously adding value to the farm too. But she said, but what if you could just remove that and AI becomes the way in which we connect across lines of language differences and cultural differences to make it more democratized, that anybody can access anybody in a way that doesn't have to have the translators or the in-betweens, the intermediaries. And in doing so, elevate and amplify perspectives that currently are often unseen or unheard.
Well, that's another Star Trek future technology, the universal translator. I mean, the original series, their mouths would move in English, and the aliens' mouths would move in English from another planet, and you really had to work hard to suspend your disbelief that this was happening. But later, they use the universal translator?
I don't think that the ideal future is just that we use AI in positive ways. I think in an ideal future, we have grown our ability to use artificial intelligence with sophistication and intentionality. And we've simultaneously raised our ability to tap into some of these ancient intelligences that we've had for millennia, that we have already, even before the arrival of generative AI, started to let fall to the backdrop. And if we could tap into some of those practices and grow those experiences of, again, eye contact, like we've talked about, or singing together in community, or any number of the practices that we have often, as societies and cultures, have held us together over and over and over again across the world. If we were to pull that forward with more intentionality, I do think the rise of both of those things together could create a more utopic future.
You know, I asked you that question about why you think that we would wind up with loneliness and isolation as so normative now, given that we know it's not rocket science to know what connects human beings. But I think about myself pretty much every night, unless we have some plans. After dinner, my husband and I sit on the couch. We call it couch time with all of our animals, 3 dogs and a cat. And we watch something on Netflix or some other streaming channel. If one of us finds it even slightly slow, out comes our phone. And I'll turn to my husband all the time and say, "You're not watching." He's like, "I'm watching." I'm like, "You're not watching. You're on your phone." So that does happen. But last night, I had known from somebody that there was a kirtan, a chanting, back and forth chanting, that was happening at a local Unitarian church. I love kirtan, and I'm like, "Oh, let's go." It took so much energy to go. You know, I had said it to my husband. He was willing to go. It's not like he really wanted to go, but he was willing to go. And so we went. But internally, I kept thinking to myself, I could just say, "Want to just stay home and have couch time?" And he would have been thrilled. But we went. And it does take this tremendous amount of energy to do what makes us human. Even if sitting and watching a story on a screen in front of us together with our animals is still connecting. So you're a mom. You have a tween and a teen daughter. And I'm wondering how you are bringing everything that you've learned to the task of, or to the privilege of raising your daughters in these times, and what you're discovering in the process.
Parenting is that humble act of learning again and again and again. What am I learning? I mean, maybe one of the things I can share that has been just such an important part of our recent experience together as a family. Last fall, my daughter had her bat mitzvah. And we are part of a community here called Judaism Your Way. And what I appreciate about the way they've designed this community is that it's less about just doing the traditions that have been passed along in the same way over and over again, and much more about interrogating what about them has meaning for you and your family at this stage and in modernity. And so we had this beautiful service in our home that my daughter wrote. So she worked with a rabbi to identify which prayers, she did the traditional prayers, but what songs and poems and prayers she wanted to put in what sequence, in addition to the traditional service. She was the one who led with the service, not the rabbi. The rabbi was the support to her with his guitar. And in doing so, she articulated her vision and values to our innermost circle in a community. Literally, we'd gone into the river in Montana and pulled rocks, stones from the river. Then afterwards, we wrote on them 13 values that my daughter has articulated are important for her as she enters into this next state of life. And then we gifted them. David and my husband and I shared stories about where we see her embodying those values already. And then we gifted those stones as a touchstone for the community to take home for the ones that spoke to them as well. And what I share all of this because what I really believe is that we need more of these rituals. And that coming of age period in a young person's life is particularly important to be able to say, I am becoming, and here's who I am, here's what I'm grappling with. And to be able to stand before people who love her and they say, yes, we see you. And we want to support you in the next phase of your life. You can imagine that happening over the course of someone's life. And religion has historically played that role for many cultures. And in the US, that is not the overwhelming primary experience of a young person growing up in today's society. And so I do long for this idea that could be accessible for all young people, this kind of coming of age rituals in a secular way. We are a multi-faith home that allows the generations to see and honor and come together in a way that strengthens who we individually and collectively want to become. So that's maybe one thing I could say. And then perhaps the other thing to say is we've been in a big dance about our own relationship to technology and when the girls will get phones and for what purposes and how they use them. And we are all learning our way forward in that too.
I feel like that's a really beautiful way to wrap up. And I want to end with a final question for you, which is, what do you want your epitaph to be?
Such a profoundly important question. She loved deeply.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you for all your work. Thank you for including me in it. I feel like one of your ambassadors now, and I'm deeply, deeply grateful for what you are doing for young people and all of us.
Well, I'm so inspired by you, and so that means everything. Thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Solutionary Voices. We would love to hear from you with a review or a subscription, and please share it with anybody who you think could benefit. And if you want to be a solutionary yourself, I invite you to read my book, The Solutionary Way, and learn how to be a solutionary. Thanks so much.